We're thrilled to be here again. I'm Ray Makela with Sales Readiness Group, and my partner Norman Behar as well. And we're excited to talk about this new topic because it's an area that is coming up more and more often. It's something that we've heard consistently from our clients going back to February. And in fact, as we'll share, we've been both selling and delivering virtually for our whole history and significantly over the last 10 years or so. So it's in our DNA, but we've had an opportunity to kind of package this together, practice what we preach, and apply that today. So again, I'm Ray, one of the partners here at Sales Readiness Group, and Norman, welcome. Really excited to jump in and share the topic with you today.
Me too. As Ray mentioned, we've been training virtually for a number of years. But if you think about the kind of pre-COVID, our primary method of training, whether it was for us or for our licensed clients, was instructor-led training. So a lot of training was being done in the classroom, and usually virtual or on-demand were being used to supplement for performance support, for reinforcement. Some global initiatives often required virtual, but with the COVID epidemic, things really changed very, very rapidly. And everyone had to take their virtual selling and to a totally different level. And so there was teams that maybe in the past sold virtually. If you were with a tech company, virtual may have been your primary method of selling. But even then, there was kind of this whole COVID experience that changed people's lives professionally, personally, in a number of different ways. And that's really what prompted us to develop something that really supplemented our skill programs. So we have, by way of background, we have programs for training sales managers, we have programs for training sales professionals, different programs depending on roles, responsibilities, and skills. But the whole notion of virtual selling. So I'd like to start with just a quick poll just to gauge our audience. So how much of your selling was virtual before COVID? So we're going to bring up that poll. And I shared with you from our experience, probably we weren't necessarily selling, but delivering skills training, probably 70% of what we were delivering was in a traditional classroom. And that just changed dramatically. So we just wanted to kind of look at what's going on pre-COVID, just to kind of gauge the audience. I mean, Ray, you've lived through this a lot. I think you delivered our last instructor-led training session in Europe, and you saw things kind of turn on a dime. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it is interesting because we refer back to that. And I remember flying back from Amsterdam. This was the very end of February. And just, reading the news, kind of seeing how things were changing in the airports and the vibe that was going on there, and thinking, wow, this is going to be really interesting to see how this evolves. And in fact, that was the last, kind of ILT or in-person training. Now, we've subsequently been extremely busy delivering on-demand, virtual, and what we call this online collaborative learning platform, which has been exciting. But I think we've seen that with our customers too. So I'd be really interested. We'll see the before and after, but we're getting this in. I appreciate those of you who are responding. We have a fantastic audience today. And I'm going to go ahead and end the polling here in just a second, and we'll see if this is kind of consistent with what people are thinking. But the idea of how much was happening in the virtual world before, and then let's see how that's evolved. So I'm going to go ahead and end this, and I'm going to share the results. So Norman, by a pretty large degree, it looked like, well, actually it's split between virtual and those who were not. So if we think about those, about 36% said they were doing no virtual at all, and 39% were doing about 25% virtual, so about a quarter of that. So adding that together, that's 75%. I think we're doing, I'd say, little or no virtual, versus kind of an all virtual environment. Curious how that resonates with kind of what you would expect and what we've seen from some of our other clients.
I think it's pretty consistent. I think the fact that, as we were sharing about, our own personal experience for many of our customers, the idea from selling, I was just doing a webinar for a medical device company, and they sold really in the hallways of hospitals. And you can imagine how that's changed so dramatically. And so if you think about companies that were 75 or 100% virtual, or 75 or 100%, in person, and now that's shifting to 0% or 25%. It's a dramatic shift. So I think the content we're going to cover today will be really helpful for virtual sellers, because the selling skills that were important in the past are still important, but now the ability to be able to build relationships and sell virtually is even more important. So let's go ahead and close that. And we've got a kind of a part two of this question. We'll just kind of get a quick snapshot of where we are now. So curious, if you look at how much of your selling is virtual now, I'm just curious what the polls would look like. We don't have to leave this open for too long,
Yep.
but we're certainly, as Ray was saying, seeing a lot of teams selling almost 100% virtually.
Yeah, and I think, that's evolved. We're certainly seeing, reopen plans. We're seeing people figuring out how to get back into the field, if you will. But we've heard a lot that in some cases it's not going to return to normal, right? Or at least pre-COVID in the same way. In other words, access may be more limited. In some cases, they're using that to clamp down or to limit outside vendors coming in, both from a security and from a hygiene or health perspective. So I think it is more challenging. It's interesting as we see, and wow, this is really fascinating. And I think there's a blog here, Norman, to publish. I'm going to go ahead and publish this. But we went from 75% who said they were doing 25% or less, basically, virtual selling pre-COVID, to now we have 75% of our audience is doing 75% or more virtual. And in fact, over half of our audience is selling 100% in the virtual world these days.
Absolutely. So I think the what we want to share with you today is really what changes in a virtual world, as the title implied and as our invitations applied. What are some of those skills and techniques you can start to use that really improves that virtual experience. Let's go ahead and close the poll.
Yep.
And I also just want to take a minute to thank everyone, not only for participating, but also we just have a really, really large attendance today. So thank you all for attending. And Ray, I know there was a new study that at GARTNER, we talk about returning to a new normal, and that new normal is likely to look different. Can you just share what that GARTNER research looks like?
Yeah, and this is just a quick snapshot, but I think it's interesting to look at, which is, this is looking at what trends are happening in the industry in general. And then this was updated, as recently as September, looking at 80% of B2B sales interactions they're predicting between suppliers and buyers will occur in a digital channel in the next 5 years. So in other words, looking at how the environment evolves and where we go from here, being able to be conversant, and that's not saying that, just like we're saying, I don't think instructor-led training is going away forever, but I think you need to be very conversant in training virtually and selling the same thing. I think there will still be opportunities to meet in person, and that's still going to be critical for some businesses, where you need to get into the operating room with the doctor and demonstrate a technology or a product, those types of things. But in other cases, I think it's going to be more and more virtual. And as Gartner's saying, hey, 80%, that's the trend anyway that we should be planning on, and that we need to be very conversant in multilingual, if you will, selling in person and selling virtually.
I think that's right. I think we were seeing this trend even pre-COVID. Many sales teams had moved towards virtual selling. And even those that do, a lot of in-person selling, that may be presentations and initial meetings, but just think about how much of the follow-up and how much of the sharing of information can now be done in virtual rooms. So, the pendulum isn't going to swing all the way back to where it was before. It's going to be kind of this new normal, and it's going to take more time. I think what we're hearing from the medical community is a vaccine doesn't just put an end to this completely. It's going to take a phase-in approach. And so I think we all have to just get better at virtual selling and used to it. And it is different. I mean, just think about how much time we spend on our webcams today and what we might have, how comfortable we felt before and how much more comfortable we're probably feeling now. And so I think that we're starting to see that people are getting more comfortable. Want to start with just a little bit about selling skills based on some research we did. This is some research we did with training industry, and we did this research a couple of years ago, but it was really based on skills that were rated very important for sales roles. You can see like identifying customer needs, a critical skill of selling, building relationships, presenting value, closing skills. So this was just kind of a list of what are those top skills, and you can see the percentages, qualifying and opportunities, negotiating skills, call planning. And as you think about these areas or other areas, we'd love to, as Alonzo mentioned earlier, really get some participation in the chat. And so the question I want to pose to the group using a chat is, what challenges are you encountering selling virtually? So just love to get some response from our participants here. I mentioned we have a really great group today. So what are some of the challenges you or your team, if you're managing a team, are facing selling virtually?
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see the responses. And again, please check all panelists and attendees. That way we can see each other's responses. And Norman, I think you're right that, those skills that you showed on the previous slide are as important as ever. And we need to be even more engaging, and we need to think about that virtual environment.
I
So
think
we're
that's the
seeing some
operative term.
responses
I
come in
mean,
here.
the term and we have to be good at all those things, but these are consistent. I mean, reaching prospects on the phone, getting a hold of the right decision makers, building relationships over the phone is not as easy as in person.
Yep.
Not everyone is tech savvy. I was on a call this morning with a company that wasn't that tech savvy, and there were some challenges on their end. We had a Zoom fatigue. We're reading all about Zoom fatigue. I think we all suffer that. Customers pretend to be too busy, so they're not that interested in engaging. Cold calling challenges. Yeah, prospecting's really, really hard. Ray, anything you're picking up from these?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a comment earlier about, you conduct the demo and then they avoid you. So that's not new in terms of a client ghosting you or not following up. But how are we managing that and managing that expectation and that commitment so that we are getting that next meeting or that follow up? So I think these are all blended in with some of those core selling skills that we'll talk about, like good call planning and good follow up.
Yeah, Robert has a really interesting point. He talks about managing objectives, and we're really big on having call objectives and call planning. But people may be hazy. They really, there'd be a reluctance to commit because people really are uncertain. And I think, the idea of bonding and building rapport, that whole relationship building is challenging. But I do think some of the things we talk about today, right in this webinar, can help the building relationship, building rapport, and some of these other challenges. So excited to continue. And I think we have a recap of just some of the challenges we had. I think most of them are covered here, but let's just go through the ones we had put in our presentation.
Absolutely. And I'll just cover one other as we move on here from Patty. And she said, how are you going to make contact? And do you have a specific reason? And I think that's an area that we have to think about how we be, ruthlessly relevant or just even more relevant and adding value for that individual just to get that meeting, because you can't just drop by, right? Or you can't just stop in and chat with the receptionist and see if you can get access or drive by the plant, whatever your industry is. So I think we have to work even harder to understand our value proposition for that individual. And we'll talk about that. I think we've seen some of these challenges, across the board. There's that lack of personal connection, right? So as people said, building rapport, and even the value of a handshake, which has been studied and researched, and the opportunity to make that connection and really start that relationship with a firm handshake. I don't know when that's coming back or if ever, right? In the same way. So we need to think about how are we replacing or reproducing that connection that happens at that initial contact point. So I think we see that. I think we have distracted buyers, we have distracted sellers, people multitasking. Many people mention Zoom or virtual meeting fatigue. We have people trying to get their head around the technology and handling that while managing the conversation. So I think actually our audience, as always, is very sharp, and I think even provided some additions to this list.
So Ray, I know that you've been working and doing a lot of research in this area, and I thought, this idea of the kind of the 4 E's of selling virtually. And so we have a white paper on the 4 E's. We're going to talk a little bit about a guide we've produced, but I want to just kind of go through that content. So Ray, do you want to introduce the 4 E's of selling virtually?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about it, there are advantages, right? There are all sorts of reasons to do it. One, we have to, as we said, 75% or more of our meetings are there. But in some ways, there are benefits. We got that initially. It's easier to access sometimes to book that meeting instead of having to fly across the country or drive to that location and get through security and all of those things. It simplifies logistics. We can leverage others on our team selling, so we can bring in experts a little bit more easily into those meetings, and that can be very valuable. We'll talk about team selling a little bit, and even engaging multiple stakeholders. So if they're not physically located in the same place, we may be able to get more people together and advance our deal because we can have them join the virtual
I
meeting.
think this is a really important point. There are, the advantages are real. So although there are certain things we can't do by selling face, that we used to be able to do, like the handshake selling face to face, this whole idea of efficiency, being able to pull in teams from across the country to join from a meeting, bringing product subject matter experts, getting multiple stakeholders, we shouldn't lose sight of this. I think this really ties back to why, in the future, Gartner's predicting that so much is going to happen digitally. I mean, just the ability to use a screen share, pull up relevant samples. Those are things you may not always have with you in face-to-face selling. So I do think these advantages are real, but there are also many, many challenges that we also discussed in our chat. So with that, Ray, should we talk about 4 E's of virtual selling?
Yeah, let's get into that. And I'll just comment on a chat that was brought up about a suggestion, hosting a virtual lunch and learn and having lunch delivered. Or I've seen people delivering lunch gift cards or things, and we're doing a monthly virtual happy hour, which has been very well attended. So I think there are ways to cut through that and still engage, and we'll talk about some different options. But I appreciate that suggestion, and I love the fact that people are collaborating in the chat and sending each other suggestions as we go along. So let me just set this up. Norman, as you said, selling skills haven't changed to the degree that we still need to do those things that we know from our research. If you execute on the fundamentals, you'll perform at a higher level. So those skills we still need to do, from booking the first meeting through closing the deal. And in addition to, so back to that and, right, we need to think about our things like our environment and how we've optimized that. We need to think about showing up with energy and excitement to combat some of that Zoom fatigue. We need to think about that connection with the individual. We'll talk about empathy. And finally, how are we engaging, since that is a bit more challenging in this world? And so we're going to break those down. This is actually a compilation of a new virtual selling program that we're launching, and we've been offering and testing and refining. So we're giving you, as we said, kind of the sneak peek. And we're not going to try to teach the course, but we're just going to give you some of the high points of this 4E model, which I think is an easy way to remember, as well as to have a checklist, right, of what are some of those things that make this a little different. So we'd like to get the input from the group. So we're going to start with the first E on environment and thinking about video and connecting. And I'm sure we've all had those good or bad impressions. And I'd love to hear some of the stories or thoughts people have about what's made for a either really good or really bad impression on a video call. So what are some of your best practices or some of your horror stories that you've heard?
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, a lot of things can happen on a video. I mean, I have a door open, closed behind me, someone could walk in, all sorts of things happen. And I'm sure as we've all started to get Zoom fatigue, we've seen a lot of things. So saying, poor lighting is a distraction. People aren't tech savvy. Background video, trying to keep it really clean. Ray's got a beautiful black screen behind him. I kind of trying to keep things uncluttered, but look like I'm in a real environment. So I'm in my den selling from home and presenting from home. So really interesting. Lack of eye contact. So where do you position that webcam? How do you look into the camera? People looking away, people going like this and looking down at to get their text message. All sorts of things can happen. Dress appropriately.
Right.
We were talking about that, matching the way your customers dress. If you're going to go and see them in person, how might you dress? Face positioning, are you way up, really close to the screen, a lot of different things. So things we don't always think about. Poor Wi-Fi, can't always control that, calls dropping. Ray, what have you seen? I mean, you're on this a lot.
No, and I think we've all lived through some of these, right? And we've seen them. And, I think even like the Wi-Fi, I mean, that was one that when we looked at this starting and realized that, we're probably going to be at home for a while, I looked at it, I think it was $10 a month or something to upgrade our infrastructure and get a really big pipe coming into the house, because we had 3 of us working every day here. And so that problem went away. And, there are some simple things like that. And we'll talk about some of the other tips and tricks around technology to make sure we're doing this. And I love all of these. Yeah, I mean, I follow, and there was a big discussion on backgrounds. Virtual backgrounds good. What should you have behind you? It's great if you can have some things to make a personal connection. Like you have a very inviting office behind you, Norman. So I think that's nice. I'm in a spare bedroom that I painted the wall flat gray just so I could have a clean background, but I don't have to worry about whether there's clutter there or the rest of the family popping in. So, there are different ways to do that, but I will say that this discussion I heard, the tendency to use a distracting virtual background, I think was the biggest thing. Like there's some really wild things out there, or if you're fading in and out and you look like you're in the Matrix, right?
Yeah,
Anything
you've got
that
that kind
takes
of
away.
ghost appearance where you're kind of ghosting. You look like you're on the beach in Hawaii, but you're turning into a ghost half the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we got a comment on the good side about keeping it interactive, allowing chat and allowing people to talk. I think those are all really good suggestions. So let's keep going. We're going to go through pretty quickly here, but on the environment and some things to think about. So each of these is kind of a lesson in and of itself, right? We really want to think about optimizing the technology. Have we tested? Do we know how the virtual application works? Have we really explored some of the edges of it? I mean, I know that's something we did. We put together a virtual guide for our sellers and our trainers to really know the ins and outs, because we're using multiple platforms, sometimes Zoom, sometimes our clients are using Teams or other technology. But just investing that hour or two to really understand the ins and outs and how it works, so you're not fumbling around. We talked a little bit about background, and I think that's something, it's personal and everybody's situation's different, but at least spending a little bit of time to do that.
Yeah.
And the one thing I will say on that is, with your video, one really simple hack is just in your start window on, if you're using a Windows device, just type in webcam. You can do that at any time and it brings up that webcam and it shows you what you look like. So before you open up the room and you're fumbling around with your customer there, test out your webcam and check your hair, check your background, see if there's clutter behind you, see what your lighting looks like. You can always bring that up and just test it out. Go ahead,
Let me share
Norman.
an
What else you're
example of
saying?
that. I was on a call this morning on a platform I'd never been on, and I got in a few minutes early, also good practice, tested the webcam, and I felt that it wasn't using my external webcam. It was using a really poor quality webcam, was the default from your laptop. So when you're going into the situation and you're using a platform you haven't used before, it's always good to check your webcam. But if you have more than one, particularly if you invest in a really good webcam, you're going to find that quite often different platforms will default to your laptop. So I just had that happen this morning. So I have kind of a real world example to share on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about appearance because we got a couple of comments. I love the interaction from the group here. This is wonderful today. So yeah, I think thinking about our how we're showing up, thinking about what we look like, the camera placement, and there's a lot that's been published and studied and looked at if you follow kind of the Hollywood practices, but they say a good actor will speak to and perform to the camera. Right. And so we need to find where that webcam is. We need to remember that if we're looking at the webcam, we're essentially looking into the person's eyes. If we're looking at the corner at their thumbnail or looking at our other monitor, right, that's going to look distracting and we've lost that personal connection. We need to work really hard to do everything we can to make that connection. Find out where your webcam is. And the other thing I'll say is get the webcam up at eye level. So it's like you're looking across the table or across the room at that person, and not the webcam's down below and it's looking up your chin or up your nose, and it's frankly not a very flattering look, or some other positioning that really distorts you if you're too close to the camera. So play around with that and test it out.
Great. I think, a couple other things, just think about the audio quality, get a really good quality headset quite often, especially if there's background noise. I had my gardeners here this morning, could hear the engines running. With a nice, good headset, you can kind of avoid those type of distractions, background noise, other people are working in your home or where you're working from. So audio quality is important, just like the webcam. These are really the attire you're bringing with you. When you think about your appearance today, it's not just your physical appearance or what shirt you're wearing or how you're dressing. It gets to your background, it gets to your audio quality, it gets to the placement of your video. So you can really control a lot in the environment. The other thing I'll say is sometimes there are things outside your control and you have to learn to adjust. There's always going to be some kind of glitch on technology that comes up probably at the most inopportune time. but you have to remember, this is the environment we're in. You're not there
Mhm.
alone. Do everything you can within your control. And if something isn't going right, don't stress about it. Just acknowledge it and try and fix it when you can. Ray, any other thoughts about environment before we go to the next D on energy?
Well, I think you're right, Norman. I think people are pretty forgiving, and we know that, if the kids end up in the background or the dog, introduce them, laugh, move on, kind of assume some of that's going to happen. But those things that are in our control, I think we should take the opportunity to, make sure the door is closed, or maybe there's a do not disturb sign on, or whatever those things are. This is your chance to make that great impression and that connection. And so, I think we need to work really hard to do everything we can to optimize that. And appearance, which came up earlier, but I use the analogy: if you were flying across the country and meeting with that executive in their corner office, how would you dress? How would you show up? What would your appearance be like? And my guess is you wouldn't show up in a t-shirt and a backwards ball cap. Yet there's so many meetings we've seen from our clients and seen with customers where that's kind of the work from home attire for a lot of people. I'm fine being casual, but as you said, Norman, think about what your customer's wearing. And I was always trained, think a level above even. So if you're selling at a director level, how do the VPs typically dress, or how would you want to make that impression and come across? I think we need to match that. I think it does make a difference.
And I will just add to that. I know we want to move on to the next subject, but we're getting
Yep.
really good tips in the chat.
Yep.
Be okay with silence. So when you're on a webcam and you pose a question, don't feel like you have to fill the airtime. It's okay to pause, see if some responses say, okay, well, let's come back to that and let's move on if you're not getting a response. But it's okay to pause and to listen. And really important that there may be delays, particularly as you're selling virtually, there can be a delay. So make sure to give it an extra minute, extra couple of seconds before you just try and fill the airtime. So thank you
Absolutely.
for the tip.
Yeah, no, and some of these we're going to get back to too, in terms of active listening and engaging. And there was a question about, how do you engage multiple people? And I think there are definitely some great things you could do, because you want to keep people engaged as you go along. But let's keep moving here. Got a couple more E's to get through, but I want to talk about energy. And before we dive into that again, I'll just ask, and we talked a little bit about things like Zoom fatigue, but I'd love to hear from the audience again. Why is it important to show up with energy? Maybe more important now than ever. And why should we be thinking about that when we're hosting these virtual meetings? So love to get thoughts from the audience here about what energy means to them and why that's important.
So we're saying from Mark, keep the meeting lively. Yeah, you want to make the meeting interesting. People are on a lot of Zoom meetings. Engage early, make sure it's really upbeat. So what are you doing to really create that kind of upbeat to it? I think when it's easy, I was watching a Zoom for a nonprofit. The speaker had a really great information, but was flat. It really didn't have any interest. There wasn't energy. Ask people to come on video from the outset. Really, we're going to get to that later, but that's a
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
great point. Get people to engage with their cameras. Typically, if you have your camera on, they're more likely. Other ideas, Ray, you're probably reading some of these too. Someone said,
Yeah,
own your role as a host. We're going to talk about meeting management.
yeah, and again, a lot of these we would want to do in person, but
Mhm.
now because we know in a lot of cases, and we hear it from our clients, they're on 8, 10 hours of Zoom meetings or virtual meetings all day long. They're going from meeting to meeting. They don't really get a break. And then we're showing up. To us, it's the most important meeting of the day, but we need to kind of, build that up or re-energize and take every opportunity we can to set the tone, right? That this is exciting, that we do want to engage. And I think we're fighting the multitasking, we're fighting the technology, we're fighting the Zoom fatigue. So I think it's more important than ever that we show up with that energy.
John has a really interesting point, which I think it's true, and we see it in in-person meetings, but it applies in virtual meetings as well. Energy translates to your being interested in your clients. So that energy shows that you're generally, it's not just a energy, but it's an excitement and a kind of a passion for what you're doing. Again, not easy on Zoom, but Ray's going to share with us some tips to really bring that energy onto our calls.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of these may seem obvious, but having a checklist or even reminding ourselves to do that. I have a standing desk here in my audience or in my office, and
Mhm.
for webinars and important client meetings, I like to stand up. And there's good research that suggests that, right? That if you stand up, you're going to be a little more animated. You're going to have a chance to move a little bit more. And again, if we were in the boardroom presenting to those executives, we'd probably be up in the front of the room presenting. I mean, depending on the meeting. But I think just that opportunity doesn't have to be a big expensive stand-up desk. You can, put your laptop up on a riser. You can lots of different ways to accommodate that. But having the opportunity to stand up, smile, and engage. I mean, again, smiling is contagious, and even moving beforehand. So we'll talk about below there, it talks about taking breaks and moving, and also before a meeting. If you've been on 3-4 hours of meetings, well, make sure you block in that 15 minutes. Maybe get outside, get a little sunlight, maybe move around. We have one of our colleagues at SRG has the mini trampoline, right? And we've all gone in there and used it because, boy, there's nothing like moving for a few minutes to get your blood pumping and kind of re-energize yourself.
Right.
So
We do some videotaping, and I know that a lot who is our host today wants me to jump on the trampoline for a few minutes when we're all in the office together, even before we shot a video. So this idea of just getting some movement, getting some energy, don't feel like you're stuck to your chair all day. Use a stand-up desk, move around. Ray does a lot of that. It's really good and it's really important. What else, Ray?
yeah, well, I think as Jason mentioned, even selling on the phone, a smile is contagious. You can hear it, you can feel it. And so it's funny just putting yourself in that mindset. And before you pick up the phone or before you engage in that virtual meeting, just making a point to smile. And again, if you're testing out your webcam, bring up your webcam and just, say, is this person engaging and exciting and somebody that I'd want to have a meeting with? So I think that's actually really helpful. Getting outside, breaking up our day. I mean, I think we're all figuring out how to work in this new environment and the work from home, but I think there are just some kind of health and hygiene things you can do to improve that. And also, and I have to point out the scheduling, I think it's easier these days to overschedule ourselves. And we end up with only a few minutes between meetings. And those may be super important meetings, but yet we're running to the next one. And, I think back to if we had to drive across town or fly across the country, we'd have a break. We'd be thinking about that meeting. We'd have our head in the game. But if we're just popping open a new virtual meeting room and haven't given ourselves a break, I don't think we're bringing our best game. So,
Well, I also think that
building
the
that
break
in.
has another benefit. So number one, it's great to just break and give yourself a little bit chance to kind of re-energize between meetings. Typically, try and give yourself 15 or 30 minutes between meetings so you're not running back to back. But particularly for selling, it has another benefit, which is it allows you to really reflect on the call you had, make notes. If you said you're going to send some things, you don't have to wait till the end of the day. So if you can kind of give yourself a half hour between sales meetings, you can then recap, say, what are the most important things I learned, start to begin to craft an email, or if you don't have time to get an email and the materials off, at least make notes so you're not blending from one meeting to the next without really thinking about what is that plan for follow-up, because follow-up is so critical to virtual selling. It's critical even for face-to-face selling, but being able to follow up. So the benefit of that little break time between meetings allows you not only to recharge and refresh, but also allows you to kind of just recap what you just covered in your prior meeting.
That's great. Yeah, and I think people may say, "Oh, well, we don't have time," or how do you schedule that? And I think we should just plan and think about that accordingly. Maybe we have to schedule out a few days or think about that. But
There's a quick question
yeah,
I want to
absolutely.
clarify, which is
Sure.
the break feasible? I'm thinking the break is between meetings with different sets of customers, not
Yeah.
necessarily a break during the same customer. For long training programs, we will put a break and that break is built in. But if you're in a sales meeting, we're not suggesting a break during the middle of the sales meeting. We're suggesting if you're, calling on customer A and then you have another call with customer B, trying to allow at least half an hour between calls to kind of recap and refresh.
Yeah, and I think that's a good clarification. So let's continue on. One of the other interesting areas, and I think this is a little bit more subtle, but it's about bringing empathy, showing up with empathy, and really demonstrating empathy today on those virtual calls. Norman, maybe you can talk about a little bit your perspective and why is this coming up, but why do you think it's important?
I think it's really important right now because this is not just a webinar or a on virtual selling. It's about virtual selling caused by a global pandemic, and it's very different. Virtual selling, if we think about many of our tech companies, they've been selling virtually for years. They've got teams of people who sell Historically they were selling out of office buildings or, or corporate offices. Now they're selling from their homes. So it's not just about virtual selling, although many of the things we're sharing apply. But this notion of empathy is that this pandemic is affecting people's lives in very serious ways. It's creating health challenges for families. Maybe they have elderly relatives. At this point, many of us know someone who's been at least contracted, COVID, maybe even worse. We also have to think about what are the implications in terms of child care, elderly care, our own personal lives, working from home. Many places people, might have two people working out of very tight conditions right now just due to personal circumstances. So it's not just virtual selling, it's virtual selling as a result of pandemic that is having a ripple effect on people's lives in very profound ways. And so I think really understanding that, Ray mentioned, well, if, I don't have young children at home, but if that door opened, I was on a call yesterday where someone was saying they had to stop the call. Their kids had gotten into they had really young toddlers, their kids had gotten into some kind of mischief. We have to understand that we can't be upset by that. That's just the reality that we're in. If someone says, hey, I've got to stop for a minute, this is going on in the background. Someone is having a bad day. It may not be you as a seller, probably isn't. It's nothing you've done. They may just have personal circumstances. So the idea is to be empathetic. We've got a little definition up here. We're not talking really about sympathy. People aren't looking for sympathy from their salespeople. They're also not looking for us to be, to be their counselor or their therapist, but they are looking for us for understanding. And so this empathy is really key. And it was a major topic in a program that I did earlier this week. And I think we asked a very similar question to the one we're going to ask now. So why is empathy so important now? I just want to get your views on that topic, because when you think about selling, and you look at our core selling skills, the research we did, empathy wasn't one of them, but it's important now. So just open up the group. And Ray, your thoughts on this? I mean, you obviously included this as one of the 4E's. Why right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, love to hear what the audience is saying. And I think you covered a number of key aspects, but I think one of the things that we realized and have run into is just how different people are being impacted. And so understanding where they are and where their company is can really help us make that connection, help us be more tuned in and prepared for that conversation. And so again, are they struggling, with a work from home situation, with kids at home? We have some clients who, are reducing headcount, and others are having their best year ever and can't keep up. So where are they in that spectrum, and how can we be prepared? So I think we're seeing some responses. I love Mark's comment. It makes us human. So I think empathy is a core skill or a core trait that we should look for anytime. But again, in the virtual world, we need to do those things that can even improve that connection. Some really good comments here that are coming in.
Kristen has a really good comment, and I am just scrolling up the screen, because we're all experiencing the same thing. And so that commonality and experience, when we think about, social networks like LinkedIn, you're looking for common backgrounds, common experiences. This is giving us a way to connect right away. So if someone says, yeah, it's been really challenging, my kids are at home, you might say, hey, well, I've got my kids at home too. Or if you don't, say, yeah, my best friend next door is in the same situation. I can kind of see how that really impacts them every single day. So it actually helps you build a better relationship. So empathy becomes one of the skills we can use right now to help develop common interests, common situation. And that's one of the keys to building better relationships.
Absolutely. And Neil mentioned he's still waiting to come across empathetic buyers. And I think, sometimes our it's not reciprocated, right? Or customers don't really have that empathy on the other side. I think this is one of those areas where you really have to be the go-giver, right? You have to pay it forward and say, well, no, I'm going to do my best to understand their situation, to make sure we're accommodating that, we're paying attention. And they may or may not reciprocate, but it's going to position us better and also help us make that connection. You can't necessarily expect that it's going to come back immediately. So Norman, let's talk about some of those ways that you can demonstrate empathy. And certainly there are other ideas, but I thought this was good. What do you think in terms of how you demonstrate?
Well, I think you want to do your research. You really want to understand how their business is doing. Is their business reducing staff? What's going on in their industry? Certain industries, as Ray mentioned are doing really very, very well. Technology, some of the medical companies. You have other industries where, you know, if you're in transportation like airlines or hospitality or foods, you know, or restaurants, those are doing very poorly. So you really want to understand the professional situation. You can learn a lot about their personal situation just in terms of having conversation with them. You can leverage mutual connections that you might have. I think, you know, Ray mentioned briefly the virtual happy hour that he
Mhm.
and some of our team are putting together. And we're actually bringing together customers from different companies, not necessarily competitive to each other, but they're in the same situation. And now we're allowing them to share with their peers what's going on, asking open-ended questions. So when you know, if you just ask, you know, how's everything going, you know, you might, it's kind of an empty question, but if you go a little bit beyond that, you really start thinking, so, you know, I'm just curious on a personal basis, you know, how has COVID impacted you? Then you're going to probably get a little bit more, hey, you know, it really hasn't been so bad for me. You know, I've been working from home for the last couple of years. So you're going to hear different things. And a key skill, maybe more important than and harder on a virtual platform, is the idea of active listening. And active
Mhm.
listening means putting away your cell phone. I was starting to get some text during the middle of this. I flipped it over. I didn't want to see them.
Yeah.
They'll be there when I'm done. Making sure you're really tuning into what people are saying, tuning into the chat. The chat is a way of people communicating today, reading what they say, using their names, listening, really important today. And also going back and paraphrasing. So, hey, you know, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like your company really isn't doing a lot right now in terms of new investment. Your priorities have really been around X, Y, and Z. So simply paraphrasing, not repeating, but paraphrasing what you heard is a great way to demonstrate those active listening skills. Ray, anything else you would add to that?
Well, I think this is a really important slide, and it's certainly not easy, and it's really hard to say, okay, we'll just do these things and it's great. But even just changing that mindset about, I really want to understand where that person is and where are they coming from. And you know, we have the three things, but it's like if you could take 5 minutes and find out three things about that person, whether it's through LinkedIn, you know, maybe you do a little bit of research, maybe you talk to a coach or advocate, somebody else who knows them, that help you, even if you don't use that in the conversation, but it helps you understand that person. Where did they come from? What was in their background? What did they study? What are their interests? It helps you understand a bit more about them. And I think you can tune into that. And it can be very effective. This isn't about manipulation. This is really about understanding so that you can serve them better.
Yeah, and I'll just say that research is important, you know, in certainly kind of in the situation we find ourselves in today, but you know, people have their different views on, you know, what's the most important selling skill. And I can't necessarily say one most important, but for me, always at the top of the list is call planning. And so
Mhm.
by doing an effective call planning, we're doing our research anyhow, and then we're making sure we have very, very clear objectives for that call. Something we're going to touch on in just a minute. So I do think the research is part of a really good call plan where you're understanding who you're speaking to, what's their current situation professionally, today a little bit also what's going on personally, and then making sure that you have really clear call objectives so that we can manage the call. So Ray, let's get into the last one, which is it's hard. How do we engage people? You know, people can tune us out. People can shut off their webcam. People can start checking their text messages. What are some of the best practices for engaging customers?
Yeah, and again, a lot of these things, this is the fourth E, right, around engagement. A lot of these things we would want to be doing in any good sales call, right? Preparing for a meeting or a sales call. But we want to be very thoughtful, and we want to think about that in our virtual world even more so, because as many people mentioned, you know, just asking open-ended or asking questions isn't enough. So I think creating that call plan, and this links to other skills we teach in
Mhm.
our other sales programs, but having that call plan that not only identifies what it is that we're trying to accomplish, but what do we expect the customer to do as a result of this call? And I think if we can change that objective to be from their perspective, at the end of the call, the customer is going to make a commitment to review our proposal, or is going to make a commitment to introduce us to their boss, or is going to share some budget numbers, whatever that is, right? So I think it's even more important to have a clear call plan so that we can manage and we know where we're headed. And then, you know, some of the other things just to manage this engagement and conversation. Got the suggestion up front when we started about using video and encouraging our customers to do the same. And we get that question all the time about, well, but what if they don't want to, or how do we get them to? And look, everybody's coming from a different situation, and they may not be in a place where they can turn their video on or feel comfortable doing that. But I find that, 9 times out of 10, if we start the call and turn our video on, these days they'll turn theirs on as well. People are much more comfortable. They've kind of figured out that that's the way we're going to converse. So I would just do it. And even if they don't turn theirs on, I would, keep yours on, show your face. It's a chance to build that connection, smile and greet them when they join the room. If there are multiple people, you're calling them out, managing it a bit like you would a training session or engaging them that way. We talked about, avoiding distractions, turning off the alerts, the pop-ups, the silencing the phone. And then it's more than just asking open-ended questions, but really having an engagement strategy of where do you need their input, and how are you going to ask that more than just, does that make sense? Or have I answered all your questions? Because we're not going to get a lot from those. But if we think about the future and say, well, help me understand, if you were to implement a solution like this, what challenges might you incur? Or how would you see this fitting in your environment? What pushback would you get? So you really start to engage them and force them, right, to participate, because I think that's going to make for a more meaningful discussion as we go along. I know there's some chats in here as well, but any other thoughts on this, Norman?
Well, I think the last one I just want to touch on is agree on next steps. And this got to the point I was making earlier about maybe allowing a little bit of time. We should have, so if you think about the first and the last bullet, they tie very close together. So you're going to have some objectives going into that call, what it is you want to accomplish. Obviously, you're going to use some of these techniques and the sound skills that we've all learned over the years to have a really engaging conversation. But did we achieve our objectives? And again, the objectives, as Ray said, should be customer driven. As a result of this call, the customer will do X, Y, and Z. We may or may not have achieved those objectives. We should do what we can in a very professional way to kind of keep the call on track. Then we have to kind of sum up and really think, well, what are the next steps based on this call, and making sure that there is some action that you can recap. So, hey, you know what? Let's try and get back together on a call next week. What's your schedule look like? I want to get back to you with a question you had on pricing or on the warranty or some other aspect. So make sure that you're tying your objectives with next steps and not just running right to the deadline. Because if you run to the deadline, which I mean the end of the call, people are going to say, hey, I've got to go, I've got another call coming, because people are, despite the advice we're offering, our
Right.
customers and many of us are forced. Like today, I will be going pretty much back to back. I do have a call at the top of the hour. And so don't let the call get timed out. Try and make sure that you're finishing 5 or 10 minutes before the call ends, so you can really recap next steps, find out what their priorities are, and agree on a follow-up strategy.
No, I think that's really important. And one of the things, we get frustrated, and we get frustrated with our clients as well, where you finish a great call, you say, how did it go? They say, oh, it was fantastic. They really love us. And you're like, great. Well, so what's happening now? Oh, well, we're going to follow up by email. And then 3 weeks later, we're still in the same position. So, let's leave that time. Let's have that question in mind, and let's know what the ask is before we go in. Again, some of these are call planning, but they're steps that we would normally want to execute, but it's even more important in this virtual conversation. So let me just cover the last area on this, and I want to leave us a few more minutes for questions at the end. And I will say, if you do have a question you'd like to ask, there's a Q&A pod as well as the chat pod or window. So if you want to ask a question, we'll try to go through those at the end, but you can type those in to the Q&A icon that you see there as well, and we'll have a little bit of time to do that. But the other thing that virtual allows us to do that I do think is an opportunity for us is to better engage in team selling. And what I mean is, now we're able to bring that technical expert, maybe that higher senior level person who wouldn't have been able to attend in person, but you can bring them into the call. You can leverage other resources, but let's make sure that everybody's on the same page, literally, and review that call plan. What are we trying to accomplish? What are the objectives? What are the roles and responsibilities? So are we joint selling? Are people taking different parts of the agenda? If the manager's on, is this a coaching call or is this a joint selling call? Because there are very different outcomes that we're looking for there. And what we don't want is the manager to then just jump in and take over, right? Talk about riding to the rescue. So let's make sure we clarify that in advance, and then somebody is moderating or facilitating, doing the introductions, calling people out, getting them engaged, and kind of orchestrating that so that we're leveraging that effectively. And we talk about the 3-second rule, but somebody mentioned that sometimes you kind of have to bite your tongue, right? If you ask a question, we should put it out there and then stop long enough for the customer to really process and respond, instead of we're jumping right ahead and then we've lost that golden opportunity to really hear what they think. So I think there are lots of different ways we can moderate that, but even more important when we have multiple people from our side on that call that may be so anxious to jump in and share their expertise that nobody gets a chance to get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, one thing I would add to this is that team selling has a lot of advantages. You can bring in a lot of people with different expertise from your team. I think one of the key things to think about is when I think about an effective call, Ray gave one element of the effective call, which is what's the continuance, what's the next steps, and not we just had a great call. The other aspect I look for is how much of the participation was from the client or from the customer. And so when your team's selling, it's really important to engage the customer to make sure that at least half of the time, hopefully 70% of the time, is spent in a listening mode. And I think that's a challenge when you have multiple resources from your company, particularly if you have less resources on the client side. You may end up dominating the call because you have 4 or 5 people from your company on the call with you. So just make sure you're giving, again, through open-ended questions, situational questions, that you're really engaging the customer and not feeling this need that every person has to take. If you have 4 people on a call and every one of them takes 10 minutes, you've only allowed 20 minutes for your customer. So make sure that everyone who's involved, when you clarify the roles and responsibilities, that each one of the participants has at least some way to engage the customer and not turn it into a broadcast, but really into, I think someone used the word earlier, and I love the word, a sales conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think one of the other factors that we've seen very successfully used is being able to chat offline. And again, you don't want to distract, and it takes a little bit of practice to be able to do that without losing the train of thought. But I know we do it quite extensively using a separate chat to communicate. If there's a question, I don't want to jump in, but I'd say, hey, by the way, I'd love to know this, or maybe we could ask about. And I think it's just there, and you have to be, a little bit flexible. But I think it's a great way to do kind of some real-time coaching, again, without over like driving from the back seat, but to be able to provide some input or collaborate. I will say the thing to test with that is make sure you know where that's going to show up. And then if you're sharing a whole screen, you don't have this chat popping up with notifications. And there are great, easy ways to do that if you're using multiple monitors or just turning those notifications off. But I think it can be a very effective way to collaborate offline during those calls.
And just one technique around that, if you're using a private chat, just as a ground rule, kind of keep the chats really short and on topic, because what you don't want to do is take away someone's focus from the primary meeting, which is really on the customer. So try and use it in a way that it's short, clear, and effective, and not just kind of a transcript of all the of thoughts that could be distracting.
No, that's great. All right, so let's kind of summarize here. But what we've tried to do is really capture the best practices, our own experience over the years, and also what we've been working with our clients on, and put that into a way that's not just saying, well, let's put virtual on the front of the key selling skills that we're already teaching, because they're great courses to do that. And in fact, people are getting training on their selling skills. But what's different, and what should we really focus on? And maybe we need to do a tune-up, or we need to do a little bit of extra work, right, to make this more appealing, especially if we think about this as a growing area. It's going to continue to be important. As we know, nobody's quite sure when we're getting back out into the field in a more meaningful way, or what that looks like, kind of industry by industry. So what we've done is we've tried to capture this information. We have a virtual selling guide, and there'll be a link to download this. You'll get a copy of the call recording, but it's a quick synopsis of this. And as we said, we're offering this as a virtual training program as well. So it's something that we can walk through. What they get is that training, that virtual guide and workbook, as well as a very simple checklist, right? That just says, hey, these are some things that you should think about following those 4 E's prior to setting up your calls, or prior to having that most important meeting of the quarter, right? Well, here's a quick reminder of things you might want to think about and some activities during the training, right? To optimize your environment, to test out your video and your audio and get a chance to practice some of those skills. So we just wanted to offer that. But what I'd like to do is actually open it back up for questions here in the last few minutes we have and turn it over to Alonzo to kind of moderate if there are other questions or comments, and we can kind of wrap things up. But I appreciate the comments from the group here as well. We'll scan through this and take any other questions. But Norman, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the collaboration and being able to share some of these thoughts.
Really thank all of our participants. I think it was great. Just I'm looking at the chat that's going on right now and just really seeing everybody participate. And again, I think as Ray mentioned, this is really an and. The selling skills that were important before are still really important, maybe more important now than ever. But in addition to those skills, just kind of techniques related to virtual selling can add a lot and make people feel a lot more confident in how they're selling and using those skills. So Alonzo, we'll turn it back to you, but we'd also love to field any questions anyone might have or follow up offline if you want to reach us based on the contact info. So Alonzo, thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Norman. Looks like I just saw a notification on the Q&A pop up, and a question is from Anand. He asks, how do you close on such virtual meetings? Negotiating would be difficult since you don't really get that personal touch.
Yeah, and I think there are really two questions. I'll take a stab at that, Norman. But closing out on a virtual meeting, I think we should think about that as part of our call plan. What do we expect to happen? What are we going to ask for? And what's the next step? Are we booking that meeting? Are we sending a proposal and having a review? So I think we need to be very clear. And then absolutely, negotiating is more difficult in that type of an environment. But I think what we need to do is schedule those sessions to say, well, let's get all those issues out. Let's make sure we have an agenda that highlights those areas we need to get into and do our call planning, or as we talk about in our negotiation class, our negotiation planning. So we know how are we going to work through those, what are the potential options, trades, responses. And at the end of that, we want to get to a contract. So who needs to be involved so that we can actually get the decision? So I think it goes back to some of the call planning. And then we need to just break that meeting up so that we're trying to accomplish the objectives we've laid out.
Right. The other point I would make in the negotiation is really we've established in the call a lot of common interests. So really making sure we can, before we get to what areas we need to resolve that are open, what is it we've already agreed to? So that gets really into that next steps in our call plan. So let's find out all the areas of common interest. And then we can also just figure out, okay, what's open, get them to agree, yes, these are the open issues. And then you've actually got a work plan. You can say, okay, here's the issues we've agreed to that are still open. Alonzo, so it looks like we have another question.
Do both parties need the same video software? Oh, this is very tech. Okay. You have an answer?
And I think the good news is, the short answer is no. And mostly if you have a working video camera and you can access that app, then you're able to collaborate in the platform. I think it used to be much more often where you had to download a bunch of plugins and there were apps that you had to install that made it more difficult. But I think that's become a lot easier in a smaller footprint, right? As we say. The other thing I'll mention is because people are using Zoom with their kids, with their families, with their grandkids, or the teams, or whatever that environment, we're running into far fewer issues with people being able to connect along the way.